In 1206, on the grasslands of Inner Asia, a ruler rose over a world that seemed to have almost none of the ingredients of empire. No monumental capital, no ancient bureaucracy, no navy, no vast settled population. Behind him stretched steppe, forest, mountain, and open sky. Ahead of him stood some of the richest and most heavily fortified states on earth. Yet within a single century, the descendants of that ruler would command territories reaching from the Pacific deep into Europe and the Middle East. They would create the largest contiguous land empire in recorded history. The familiar explanation is almost too convenient. Horses, bows, and terror. All three mattered. None of them is enough. The Mongols became extraordinary because several advantages began to reinforce one another. Movement became organization. Defeated enemies became new manpower and new expertise. Distance became a communications problem that could be managed. Conquest itself became a way of acquiring knowledge. Their empire did not begin when they learned how to break city walls. It began earlier, when Temujin learned how to keep the steppe from breaking his coalition apart. Before there was a Mongol Empire, there was no single Mongol nation waiting to march across Eurasia. The eastern steppe was a shifting political landscape of clans, rival leaders, tribal confederations, marriages, raids, alliances, and betrayals. Power was personal. A chief remained powerful only while followers believed he could protect them, reward them, and continue to win. Temujin, the man later known as Genghis Khan, emerged from that unstable world. Much of the narrative of his early life comes from The Secret History of the Mongols, the indispensable Mongolian account composed not long after his lifetime. But it is also a court-centered literary source, shaped by memory, politics, and storytelling. Its broad historical value is immense. Some of its most dramatic episodes cannot be independently confirmed. The surviving evidence makes clear that Temujin did not rise from effortless security. His father died while he was still young. His family lost much of its political support. The lesson of his early world was brutal in its simplicity. An alliance that exists today may vanish tomorrow. Over the following decades, Temujin fought rivals, entered alliances, abandoned some, rebuilt others, rewarded loyalty, and absorbed defeated followers. Eventually, the major competing powers around him were eliminated, subordinated, or drawn into his expanding coalition. But victory created a new danger. Steppe history already knew how quickly a brilliant leader's coalition could unravel. A war chief could gather thousands for a campaign, die, and leave the political structure built around him to fragment almost overnight. Temujin needed more than obedience. He needed a system that could outlive the moment of conquest. In 1206, a great assembly recognized him as Genghis Khan. The title announced the triumph of one ruler. But the deeper transformation happened beneath it. Warriors and households were organized through decimal units of tens, hundreds, thousands, and 10,000s. Decimal organization had older precedents on the steppe. Genghis Khan did not invent the idea. What mattered was how extensively he used such structures to reorder political loyalty. Traditional clans did not vanish. This was not a modern meritocracy, and the imperial family remained supreme. Aristocratic privilege, kinship, and dynastic politics would continue to shape the empire. But rival tribal identities could no longer function as easily as independent military machines. Defeated groups could be divided and reassigned. Men who had once served competing chiefs could find themselves inside the same chain of command. Individuals of comparatively modest origin could sometimes rise through demonstrated ability and loyalty. Command became harder to monopolize through old tribal status alone. It was political engineering, wearing the armor of an army. A warrior was no longer useful only to the chief he had been born beneath. He had become a component in a structure that could detach units, recombine them, reinforce them, and send them far from their original homeland. Conquered fighters could be incorporated as well. That meant every victory carried the possibility of enlarging the machine that had produced it. Then came the animal that made the machine move. Mongol warfare was built around mounted mobility. Skilled horse archers used compact composite bows suited to fighting from horseback, and riders could travel with several remounts. Instead of driving a single animal to exhaustion over a long march, a rider could change horses and continue. The effect was more than tactical speed. It was strategic tempo. Mongol forces could appear sooner than expected, alter routes, split into columns, and preserve mobility over enormous distances. But the image of limitless cavalry can be misleading. Horses are not machines. They need water, They need pasture. A very large mounted force can consume grazing land with astonishing speed. Seasons, snow, drought, river crossings, fodder, and the condition of grass could decide what an army was physically capable of attempting. And here, modern science adds a remarkable possibility. A long tree ring record from central Mongolia indicates an unusually wet and relatively mild interval during much of the empire's early expansion, particularly around 1211 to 1225. Researchers have proposed that richer grasslands could have increased livestock productivity and supported larger herds. That is a hypothesis about favorable conditions, not a climatic explanation for world conquest. Rain did not invent Mongol institutions. Grass did not choose commanders or defeat fortified states. Leadership, political consolidation, military skill, and adaptation remained essential. But in a society whose transport, food economy, and military power depended heavily on animals, better pasture may have expanded the physical possibilities available to the new state. The Mongol war machine could, in a very literal sense, turn grass into movement. But movement without information is only fast confusion. Mongol campaigns relied heavily on scouting, reconnaissance, intelligence, signaling, and disciplined coordination. Columns could travel apart across broad fronts, approach from different directions, then concentrate again when required. Feigned retreats and encirclement were not inventions of the Mongols. They belonged to much older steppe traditions. Mongol commanders made them especially dangerous by embedding them within a larger system of command. The target was not only an enemy army, it was the enemy's understanding of the battlefield. A force might withdraw and invite pursuit while another maneuvered elsewhere. A ruler could receive news from one frontier, while a different Mongol column was already moving toward another. Even the expected road could become irrelevant if cavalry crossed terrain defenders had assumed a major army would avoid. A kingdom can survive losing a battle. It becomes far more vulnerable when its leaders can no longer tell where the real battle is going to be. Eventually, speed met an obstacle it could not simply outrun: a wall. Their first great campaigns against powerful sedentary states unfolded in northern China. A major campaign against the Tangut state of western Xia in 1209-1210 forced it into submission. In 1211, the Mongols opened a major war against the Jurchen Jin dynasty, rulers of northern China. The Jin world presented problems the open steppe did not: dense populations, infantry, fortified cities, established administrations, and generations of siege experience. Cavalry could isolate a fortress, but a horse could not climb a masonry wall. So the Mongols did something more important than insisting on what had already worked. They changed. As their armies entered settled regions, they incorporated engineers, infantrymen, craftsmen, translators, administrators, and military specialists from conquered or submitted populations. Chinese and other siege experts gave Mongol forces capabilities that the original steppe coalition had not possessed. This became one of the decisive patterns of Mongol expansion. Every enemy was also a school. If a conquered society possessed useful expertise, the Mongols were often willing to employ the people who understood it. Siege engineers could be reassigned, along with scribes, translators, physicians, accountants, tax specialists, craftsmen, and merchants with long-distance connections. Uyghurs, Chinese, Persians, Central Asians, and many others became essential to an empire often imagined as a purely Mongol enterprise. It did not conquer by remaining technically pure. It conquered by becoming more complicated after almost every major victory. In 1215, Zhongdu, the Jin capital near modern Beijing, fell to Mongol forces. Yet the Jin dynasty survived until 1234. That long struggle matters because it punctures the legend of effortless conquest. Mongol armies could be stopped. Campaigns could stall. Invasions elsewhere could fail completely. Their great strength was not supernatural invincibility. It was the ability to learn from resistance. The next transformation came from a frontier crisis that pulled the empire west. In 1218, a trading mission associated with the Mongol realm reached Otrar, a city of the Khwarezmian Empire. The caravan was seized and its merchants were killed. The surviving sources do not agree on every detail, and accounts differ over how much responsibility rests with the Khwarezmian ruler, Shah Muhammad II. What is clear is that the confrontation escalated. A later Mongol mission seeking redress was rejected, and at least one envoy was killed. To Genghis Khan, this was not merely a personal insult. Trade, diplomacy, and protection were part of imperial authority. If people traveling under Mongol protection could be killed at a frontier with no effective answer, then the authority of the Khan ended exactly where another ruler chose to ignore it. In 1219, the Mongols invaded Khwarezm. They were not attacking an empty frontier. The Khwarezmian state stretched across wealthy urban and agricultural regions of Central Asia and Iran. Bukhara and Samarkand belonged to an interconnected Islamic world of commerce, scholarship, irrigation, craft production, and government. Its wealth, however, did not automatically produce a unified defense. Mongol forces divided. Columns advanced by different routes. Strongholds were isolated. Threats appeared in several places before the defenders could build one coherent picture of the invasion. Instead of presenting a single army that could be located, blocked, and brought to one decisive battle, the Mongols created multiple crises at once. Mobility became psychological pressure. The enemy was forced to react to a threat that seemed to change shape faster than reports could travel. The consequences were catastrophic for many communities. Cities that resisted could face devastating punishment. Populations were displaced. Agricultural and urban regions in parts of Central Asia and Iran suffered severe damage. Medieval chroniclers sometimes report casualty figures on an enormous scale, but exact totals are notoriously difficult to establish, and modern historians treat many of those numbers with caution. The destruction is historical fact. The apparent precision of some medieval statistics is not. Mongol violence also served strategic purposes, although strategy is not justification. Surrender could lead to incorporation. Resistance could trigger harsh reprisals. The fate of one city could become a message carried to the next before the Mongol army itself arrived. Fear could save time, and time, in an empire powered by movement, was a military resource. But fear alone cannot hold a continent. A state that only destroys eventually consumes what it needs to tax, recruit, communicate through, and govern. The Mongols were learning a second lesson alongside destruction. Preserve what is useful. Artisans were relocated. Administrators could remain in service. Merchants could receive protection. Local elites might continue to govern or collect revenue under Mongol supervision if they accepted the new order. Military specialists taken from one frontier could later serve on another, thousands of kilometers away. For people who were forcibly moved, this was not cultural exchange in any gentle sense. It could mean coercion, separation, and trauma. For the empire, it meant expertise had become portable. At the very moment when the entire project still seemed inseparable from one personality, the founder disappeared from the story. Genghis Khan died in 1227 during his final campaign against Western Xia. He had not conquered all of China. He had not conquered Europe. The empire had not yet reached anything like its maximum extent. By the old logic of steppe coalitions, his death should have been the point of fracture. Instead, expansion continued. That may be the most important evidence that Genghis Khan had built something more durable than personal charisma. His son Ogedai was formally chosen as Great Khan in 1229. Under Ogedai, conquest continued, but institution building became equally important. The Jin dynasty was finally destroyed in 1234. Karakoram developed into an imperial center. Across conquered territories, taxation and administration became more regular, although the empire never imposed one identical bureaucratic model everywhere. Soon, the empire stretched beyond anything one court could hope to see with its own eyes. That brought it face to face with the most dangerous enemy of every consolidated power: distance. An army may capture a city in days. A government can spend months learning what happened there. And by the time an order reaches a frontier, the problem may already have changed. The Mongols attacked that delay with a relay system known as the Jam, or Yam. Earlier Eurasian states and steppe societies had long used forms of mounted relay communication. The principle was not new. Under Mongol rule, however, relay routes grew into a vast instrument of command, breaking enormous journeys into stages served by fresh horses. At stations along those routes, authorized messengers and officials could obtain remounts, provisions, and logistical support before pushing onward. Imperial tablets of authority, often described with terms such as paisa or gerej, could identify people entitled to such services, though the privileges were also abused and repeatedly had to be regulated. It was no public postal service in the modern sense, and the speed came at a price. Communities along the network could be burdened with demands for horses, food, labor, and taxes to keep the stations functioning. For the state, however, each fresh horse did something extraordinary. It made a continent feel smaller. orders moved faster. Reports returned sooner. Envoys traveled under recognized authority. Places separated by mountains, deserts, and weeks of hard travel could still be pulled into the same chain of command. The empire was giving itself something like a nervous system. While messages raced along that system, Mongol armies were already moving farther west than Genghis Khan himself had ever gone. Beginning in 1236, a vast western campaign led by members of the imperial family, with Batu and the general Subutai among its central figures, struck Volga Bulgaria and the Rus principalities before advancing into Central Europe. In 1241, Mongol-led armies fought major battles at Legnica in Poland and Mohi in Hungary. The shock was not simply that warriors from the eastern steppe had reached the heart of Europe. It was that methods developed and refined thousands of kilometers away still functioned at continental scale, and the armies themselves had changed. They included substantial numbers of Turkic and other troops absorbed into the imperial military world. By now, the word Mongol could describe not only an ethnic group, but a political and military system commanding many peoples. In 1242, that westward surge suddenly changed direction. The armies withdrew from Hungary. For generations, the cleanest explanation was the death of Ogedei in late 1241 and the political consequences of succession. His death certainly mattered, but historians still debate why the Western army left when it did.
Strategic goals, local resistance, political calculations, pasture, environmental conditions, and the practical limits of campaigning in the region have all entered the discussion. There may never be one dramatic answer. The uncertainty matters, because behind the mystery of the withdrawal, a larger problem was coming into view. The most dangerous limit on further expansion was no longer only outside the empire. It was emerging inside the ruling dynasty itself. Genghis Khan had distributed rights, territories, and spheres of authority among different branches of his family, while preserving the principle of a supreme Great Khan. But each generation created more princes, more courts, more armed followings, and more regional interests. The imperial system had proved highly effective at absorbing outsiders into military and administrative service. Competition among the founders' own descendants proved far harder to contain. For a time, another Great Khan restored a high degree of central coordination. Monk came to power in 1251 and launched a new phase of expansion. His brother, Hulagu, led a major campaign westward. Another brother, Kublai, became increasingly important in the struggle against the southern Song in China. Mongol power was now being projected across distances that would have seemed almost absurd only 2 generations earlier. In 1258, Hulagu's forces captured and sacked Baghdad. The Abbasid Caliphate, centered in the city, came to an end. Medieval accounts give widely differing casualty totals, and exact numbers cannot be treated as secure. The political significance, however, is unmistakable. One of the most celebrated cities of the medieval Islamic world had fallen to an army operating thousands of kilometers from the Mongolian steppe, where the empire had begun. On a modern map, this can look like unstoppable power. On the ground, the empire was nearing a political fault line. In 1259, Monk died while campaigning in China. His death triggered a struggle for the supreme title between Kublai and his brother, Arik Bok. Other branches of the ruling family followed their own priorities. Mongol rulers who shared ancestry, prestige, and imperial traditions increasingly found themselves on opposing sides. The empire had grown too politically plural to remain forever under a single command. Kublai eventually defeated Arik Bok. In 1271, he proclaimed the Yuan dynasty, and in 1279, Yuan forces completed the conquest of the southern Song. By then, Genghis Khan's descendants ruled across an extraordinary part of Eurasia. Yet political reality no longer matched the clean color of a modern historical map. Here lies the central paradox of the Mongol achievement. At almost the same moment that Mongol power reached its greatest collective geographical extent, the political unity behind that power was already dissolving. So what, by then, had the conquests actually created? Certainly not a uniform superstate governed everywhere by the same laws, the same officials, and the same institutions. What emerged was a family of enormous dynastic realms, linked by descent, diplomacy, roads, commercial networks, political traditions, and the memory of a common imperial project. The Yuan ruled China and Mongolia. The Ilkhanate took shape in Iran and neighboring lands. The descendants of Jochi dominated the western steppe in the realm later known as the Golden Horde. Central Asia fell largely under Chagatate rule. At times, these states cooperated. Envoys, information, and goods could still pass between their courts. At other times, armies crossed the same spaces to fight fellow descendants of Genghis Khan. Political unity weakened. Yet the roads, relay stations, commercial ties, and administrative networks did not vanish when the center began to fracture. Mongol rulers paid close attention to long-distance commerce. Merchants could form partnerships with members of the imperial elite, while protected routes and privileges encouraged trade across large parts of Eurasia.
On the ground, that connectivity was not an abstraction. It meant caravans moving farther under recognized protection, envoys carrying intelligence between courts, and goods passing through political zones that had once been more fragmented. Historians often use the later expression Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, to describe this intensified connectivity associated with Mongol rule. But the phrase is too clean if taken literally. There was no universal peace. Mongol successor states fought one another. Rebellions continued. Fiscal demands could be severe. Some regions benefited from expanded trade, while others still lived with the damage of conquest. Even the relay system imposed heavy obligations on communities required to sustain it. What spread across Eurasia was not peace in every place. It was connection enforced by power, and that connection had a human scale. Along the routes moved silk, metalwork, horses, luxury goods, diplomatic intelligence, artistic styles, technical knowledge, and scientific ideas. With them traveled craftsmen, physicians, translators, clerics, envoys, soldiers, administrators, and merchants, crossing distances that earlier political fragmentation had often made more difficult. For some travelers, those routes opened opportunities that had not existed before. For others, movement came by imperial order rather than choice. The same road could carry profit in one direction and coercion in another. Merchants and officials were not the only things moving across this imperial world. Beliefs crossed it too. Across the Mongol domains, rulers encountered Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, Taoists, and practitioners of indigenous steppe traditions. Clerics and religious institutions could receive patronage or exemptions, and several Mongol rulers became known for accommodating more than one faith at court. But accommodation should not be confused with modern religious liberty. Policy varied from ruler to ruler and from region to region, and tolerance was often political. For an empire governing societies with radically different beliefs, enforcing religious uniformity could create resistance where loyalty, revenue, and order mattered more. Over time, the balance shifted again. Different branches of the ruling family increasingly adopted the religious traditions of the lands they governed. The larger pattern is clear. Mongol rule did not require everyone beneath it to become Mongol. Difference could be made useful to imperial power. Religious policy is not the only place where modern labels can mislead. Mongol law requires the same caution. Popular retellings sometimes describe a single written Great Yassa, as though a complete constitution personally issued by Genghis Khan survived intact for historians to consult. It does not. Medieval sources instead refer to orders, regulations, precedents, and practices associated with the Chinggisid dynasty, the descendants of Genghis Khan. And scholars still debate how those references should be reconstructed. What can be seen more securely is something more flexible, a system capable of changing shape from region to region without surrendering imperial control. In practice, Mongol governments could preserve local fiscal practices, employ existing bureaucracies, appoint imperial overseers, conduct censuses, demand tribute, and reshape administration according to local conditions. A solution that worked in northern China did not have to look identical to one used in Iran, Central Asia, or the Rus lands. The political center could remain Mongol, even when much of the machinery beneath it was local. Uniformity was not the goal. Control was, preferably without destroying useful structures already in place. That flexibility answered one of history's hardest imperial problems. How can a relatively small, conquering population dominate enormous settled civilizations with their own languages, religions, economies, elites, and political traditions? Often the answer was to avoid replacing everything at once. Mongol power could stand above existing institutions, reshape them, and redirect their resources towards a new imperial center. Use local knowledge, move specialists where they are needed, keep the dynasty at the summit, preserve military superiority, protect communications, reward useful service, punish rebellion. Above all, keep information moving faster than resistance can coordinate. That is how horsemen from the steppe became rulers of cities. But the moment the system succeeds, a new tension appears.
The same flexibility that helps an empire govern distant worlds can also pull its rulers toward those worlds. Every successful adaptation bound regional Mongol rulers more tightly to the societies they governed. Princes ruling in China became part of Chinese imperial politics. Mongol courts in Iran increasingly operated through Persian and Islamic institutions. The Western steppe developed its own political and commercial priorities around the Rus principalities, the Black Sea, and the wider Eurasian steppe. The farther Mongol rule extended, the less every branch of the dynasty needed the same future. Different courts faced different neighbors, revenues, elites, and priorities. A prince in China and a Khan on the Western steppe might share ancestry, but increasingly they did not share the same political horizon. The flexibility that made Mongol rule expandable was also making it divisible. That brings us back to the question beneath the legend. How did the Mongols build the largest contiguous land empire in recorded history? There was no single secret. Their bows had predecessors. Their cavalry methods had predecessors. Decimal military organization had precedents. Mounted relay systems had precedents. Siege technology was frequently acquired from other societies. Even the unusually favorable climatic interval identified by tree ring research would have been an opportunity, not a sufficient cause on its own. The advantage lay in the combination, and in the speed with which that combination could adapt. Genghis Khan unified a political landscape that had repeatedly fractured. His reorganization weakened competing tribal military structures without abolishing aristocratic power. Mongol armies fused mobility with discipline. Commanders used reconnaissance and maneuver to create uncertainty. Conquered populations became sources of soldiers, engineers, officials, translators, administrators, craftsmen, and information. Communications networks connected distances that had shattered earlier political coalitions. Useful knowledge was absorbed rather than discarded. Each successful conquest could make the next campaign more knowledgeable than the last. That is perhaps the most unsettling part of the Mongol story. Conquest did not merely expand the empire, it could improve the machinery of conquest itself. For a crucial period of the 13th century, much of Eurasia confronted an imperial system that did more than move faster than many opponents. It observed them, learned from them, absorbed what worked, and carried those lessons onward. Eventually, however, adaptation stopped working only outward. It began to transform the empire from within. The Mongols learned from the civilizations they conquered, and their rulers embedded themselves inside those civilizations. Regional governments developed their own institutions, religions, commercial interests, political habits, and rival ambitions. The unified Mongol Empire fractured. Its consequences did not. Long after political unity weakened, the effects of the imperial century continued to move through Eurasia, carried by roots, institutions, memories, and people. The roots they maintained, the communities they displaced, the specialists they moved, the commercial connections they protected, the technologies and artistic forms that traveled through their domains, the political systems they transformed. None of it simply vanished when the dynasty divided. The map broke apart. Many of the connections beneath it remain. Borders changed again and again. Distance itself did not simply return to what it had been before 1206. Genghis Khan had begun by uniting peoples of the eastern steppe. By the end of the century, his descendants had done something larger than conquer territory. Through war, administration, trade, forced migration, diplomacy, and communication, they had drawn societies separated by thousands of kilometers into sustained contact on a scale the medieval world had rarely experienced. So perhaps the final mystery is no longer how riders from Mongolia crossed Eurasia. By now, the mechanisms are visible. The harder question begins after conquest, once distant societies have been pulled into the same imperial history, and the empire that connected them begins to break apart. What happens when those connections outlive the empire that created them? Armies could withdraw, dynasties could split, Khans who shared the same ancestry could become enemies. New frontiers could harden across territories that had once answered, however unevenly, to the same imperial project. But the societies on either side of those new frontiers had already been drawn into deeper awareness of one another. Goods, techniques, ideas, information, and people had crossed the distances between them, sometimes by opportunity, sometimes by command, sometimes through violence. The borders would keep changing. The old distances would never mean quite the same thing again.